Welcome to the Real Estate Syndication Show. Whether you are a seasoned investor or building a new real estate business, this is the show for you. Whitney Sewell talks to top experts in the business. Our goal is to help you master real estate syndication. And now your host, Whitney Sewell.
This is your daily real estate syndication show. I'm your host, Whitney Sewell. Today our guests are Alex Shandrovsky and Michael Brady. Thank you both for being on the show today, guys.
Pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
I know all the listeners, if you are in the syndication business, I know this is a topic and question that I get often and that I've had to deal personally in our own business as well, is how do we do a 1031 exchange into a syndication? And there's, it seems so complex in the beginning and what that should look like. And I know you as the listener also have questions about how to do this properly. And these guys are experts. They are the experts on 1031 exchange. So, but a little about them before we get started. They both represent Madison 1031, a national qualified intermediary for tax-deferred exchanges to Internal Revenue Code 1031. Alex is a Silicon Valley seasoned entrepreneur. Starting with a $3,000 loan, he built a multi-million-dollar catering business serving leading tech companies, including Google, Airbnb, and Facebook. As business director for Madison 1031, he provides clients with expert, lawyer, and CPA-approved 1031 exchanges. Michael is executive vice president at Madison 1031 and is a certified exchange specialist and attorney. He has over 25 years of experience representing clients in commercial and residential real estate transactions, as well as a wide variety of business transactions and commercial litigation matters, and has acted as general counsel to the title insurance company. So, guys, thank you all again for your time today. But get us started a little bit about maybe just briefly. I know two of you at one time. We don't have tons of time to dive into backgrounds, but just briefly tell us a little bit about yourself so we can get into this subject that I know a lot of people are wondering about.
Sure. So Mike and I kind of like the odd couple a little bit. So my background is a small business operator. So essentially I started a small business in Silicon Valley. And one of the things I was always looking for is how to be able to scale my cash flow, right? And I learned much more about real estate and real estate services, which brought me to Madison 1031. But I look at it from that small business operator who's looking and be able to create the most effective investment possible. Mike, share a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. So I'm an attorney, as you heard, predominantly in business and real estate. Got involved in 1031 exchanges in 2005, specifically or exclusively as a qualified intermediary. And during that time, I've helped investors defer, I'd say, probably about $1 billion in taxes and doing tax-deferred exchanges and structuring transactions, specifically with syndicators and some ideas we have for syndication.
Awesome. Well, I mean, that's a big deal to defer a billion. Did you say $1 billion?
Yeah.
$1 billion in taxes. I mean, what a great vehicle or avenue here that we need to know about, right? I mean, you're in the real estate business. You need to know about a 1031 exchange, and specifically in the syndication business, you need to know how to help that investor who has that property they're selling and they want to invest. Like I want to be confident in this to be able to say, yes, we can do this, or no, we can't. Or if we do, then this is how we need to move forward. And so, if you all could just, elaborate or get us started in this process, I'd love to be able to speak to the operator that's listening right now that's saying, I don't know if I can take 1031 money into my syndication, and so maybe, you all could get us started in that and let's walk through that process.
Mike, is it all right if I just start us off for a second?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Alex.
So let's just take a second and first think about the motivation of the 1031, the individual who's actually doing the 1031 exchange, right? What's the mindset of the 1031 investor? And then we'll bring it into the syndicator. So essentially, an example I love to use is the IRS is kind of like the Uncle Sam. So he's always that strange uncle who invests with you at every single investment that you make. And when you're ready to actually sell your investment and there's been capped appreciation, he's coming to you and saying, look, we did so well. It's time for you to give me a percentage of that appreciation, right? Now, but he says, wait a second. You've done so well in the market that I really want you to keep your money in the market. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you this 1031 exchange vehicle, which is going to allow you to fully reinvest all the proceeds from the sale into another into like-kind exchange, into another like-kind investment property. Now, there's a lot of stipulations and limitations around that, but the motivator behind an individual doing a 1031 exchange is, first of all, he's an individual who is looking to reinvest all the proceeds of his sale into the market. He's not looking to just cash out. Two is usually those individuals are looking for a long-term play, right? Some of the individuals that we interact with are going to continue doing exchanges until the point of death, right? Where it's going to allow the stepped-up basis for their inheritors. So we're looking for somebody who's really long-term thinking, a seasoned investor, and really is ready to be able to play long-term in the market. And the government is working alongside of him to move the market forward. Now, Mike, could you share a little bit some of the challenges of a syndicator when he's looking at bringing a 1031 investor inside of his syndicate?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me just kind of support what you just said. These are essentially 1031 exchange is a term-free, interest-free loan from various levels of government. And we're talking about the federal government as well as the various states and some cities that actually impose taxes on capital gains that allow you to go out and buy bigger and hopefully more profitable property. So with syndicates in particular, there's some challenges. So the way I look at this is two ways. So you have syndicators who are looking for 1031 investors. Okay, that's one set of challenges, bringing 1031 money into a syndication, as well as the flip side of that, when the syndicated deal is ready to be turned over, is going to be sold to a third party, how do we get our syndicated investors out and allow them to do 1031 exchanges? Okay, so there are two different challenges. It's kind of two sides of the same problem. And it all stems from the fact that essentially the taxpayer who sells the relinquished property, that's the property that they're going to defer the taxes on, has to be the same investor that buys the replacement property, which is the property they'll be investing their capital gain in. And so, and we're talking about taxpayers. And so what happens with syndicated deals is predominantly they are set up these days in limited liability companies. They could be limited partnerships as well, that typically are going to be viewed as a partnership for tax purposes. Okay, and that means the partnership is actually going to be the entity or the taxpayer that owns the property. And we can certainly have an LLC or a limited partnership sell a piece of property and go buy a piece of replacement property in that same structure, and that's fine. We can do that all day long. It's the same taxpayer on both sides of the coin. It becomes more problematic, though, where we have an individual who is selling a property and wants to invest in a syndicated deal that's owned by a partnership. And vice versa, if we have a syndicated deal in a partnership that is going to now sell, and we have individuals who want to go off and buy in their separate, in their own names or in, different entities. So that's the problem. And that's really the crux of what the issue is. It's a very, very complicated issue. It's a tough one to get around. Essentially, what we have to do is we have to allow for the same investor on both sides of the exchange. So this can be done two ways. Typically, for the investment into a syndication with a 1031 investor, we would have the investor join in the property, not as a member of the ownership entity, the limited liability company or the partnership. We would bring them in as a tenant in common. So they would have a separate deeded interest in the project along with the syndicated entity. Okay. And there's some formalities we have to respect in that relationship. This is not a great, honestly, not a great arrangement for a syndicator where you would have some preferred returns, some waterfalls and some bumps for the syndicator. But initially, we want to bring them in as a tenant in common, and you could have these co-owners. We should look at, I'm going to throw out some legal lingo here, so forgive me. We want to look at Revenue Procedure 2002-22, which gives us some guidance on how to be set up as a tenant in common versus a partnership. And, they can operate that way for a period of time. And at some point down the road, and that's not necessarily a magic number, they can then have the tenant in common investor contribute their ownership to the syndicated entity and become part of the family, essentially. Okay, so that's one way for bringing in syndicated money. Likewise, on the exit from the syndicate, we also have to kind of bring ourselves out of the partnership model into individual ownership. So we would do something, typically it's called a drop and swap, where we would basically have the syndicate deed out individual interest in the property to the taxpayers, to the syndicated, the investors, so that they could then go on their separate ways and go buy replacement property on their own. There's some timing consequences to that. We want to do this in advance. We don't want to do this at the last minute. It may make sense, a couple of years before the target of selling the property to restructure the entity into tenant in common. That's some things to look at. This is something that you really need to work with tax and legal advisors in advance and plan to make sure that you're going to be in compliance or have your transaction meet scrutiny if the IRS or the state governments were to audit. So,
no doubt about it. Well, yeah. I mean, like you just proved that, okay, we need expert counsel because most of that just went over my head.
Yeah, and, I'm sorry about that.
No. It's good. It's really good. And I want to hear it. I want the listeners to hear it as well. But ultimately why we need somebody like yourself on our team if we're going to try something like this. Because ultimately I want to be able to take 1031 money. I want to be able to, I never want to tell an investor, no, we can't do that. And say, okay, how can we do it? And let's see if we can make this happen.
Sure.
But obviously there has to be some guidelines, of what we can do and is it worth our time and investment, of all those things. But you had said, I just wanted to back up a little bit. So the tenant in common structure, that tenant in common structure, if we were thinking on a chart of the structure, obviously we have the general partnership, we have the limited partners, but really that tenant in common, I mean, it's their own entity and they're part of the general partnership. Is that correct?
Yeah, so they're separate from the general partnership, correct. They're their own entity. They have their own interest or ownership of the property. So they might have, let's say they were contributing, 10% of the cash to the deal. They would have a 10% deeded interest in the property. And they cannot be part of the same arrangement with the rest of the investors. So that's the challenge.
So how do we handle their returns and things like that? If they're not part of the limited partnership, what should that look like?
Yeah, so if they're not part of the general partnership, as under that revenue procedure I referenced, it's important that their returns match their interest in the property. So they are entitled, they're a 10% investor, they would get a 10% return on their investment, of the profits. You can do some things. Obviously, the syndicator, to the extent that they're managing the property, they're entitled to management fees, and you can set up arrangements like that. And that may work for, let's say 2 years. You might want to be stuck in that structure, and there may be some other creative things. I always kind of try to get the accountants involved, see if there's other creative things we could do about the returns. But that's essentially the structure, and should be for a limited period of time. 2 years is not a magic number, but seems to be a relatively good number in tax, in some of the tax codes for other areas.
So, I've been told in the past, it's like, unless an investor is investing just multiple millions of dollars into your deal, it's not worth, doing the 1031 exchange. And I'd love your opinion about that. Or is there a threshold, that the listener and myself could say, okay, unless you're doing this much, it's really not worth, the time.
Mike, could you just allude also to what are some of the limitations when you bring a tenant in common in terms of how does it bind the arms of the GP? Because I think that's a really key reason why a syndicator might feel like I don't want to have that kind of level of responsibility or limitation, and potentially how do we get around it? Because that might open up a conversation on smaller investments.
Yeah, sure. So I guess there's two questions. Yeah, there's two questions. So what dollar value makes it worth it? It's really kind of hard to say. Obviously, I don't think if you have a multi-million-dollar project, you probably are not doing this for $100,000 of investment, right? It probably doesn't make sense at that point. So certainly, the larger the investor, the more accommodating you'll probably be willing to be.
Sure.
Some of the limitations that you have with the TIC structure. I think the big one I mentioned, they have to receive a return equal to their investment. In a TIC structure, there's some decisions that are made by the property owners have to be done by unanimous consent. So you could have a TIC owner could conceivably hold up the sale of a property, or at least to the extent that they refuse to sell their interest. So there are some
even if that TIC owner is just say a 1% owner of the property. Because the sale has to be unanimous. Is that correct?
Sure. I mean, that's so much at the sale. I mean, the 99% is free to sell their 99%, and leave the 1% in there, but it certainly affects the marketability of a property. If you have particularly a recalcitrant owner of the property is not maybe, the most advantageous partner for a buyer to have. So it does create some problems. And so when we see this, typically it's parties that have a relationship. You're not probably going to go find, a third party out in the marketplace who you've never done business with before for this, because it takes a lot of trust and cooperation, and can create problems down the road. And likewise, this is part of the restructuring on the flip side, where, while we find so many people doing what I call the drop and swap at the last minute rather than planning years in advance, because they really like the control that the syndicate structure gives them versus the tenant in common structure.
Okay. So I guess, get us started in this process a little bit. I was thinking about, if we have an investor that wants to 1031 into one of our syndications, what does that look like to make that actually happen and structure that, or make sure we're doing it legally and working with somebody like yourself?
Yeah, sure. And so I know, Alex, did you want to jump in at all? Or?
No, I'm going to come in a minute.
Okay. Yeah. So, structurally, you'll have somebody who sold a piece of property, right? They've entered into a 1031 exchange. Very critical that they do that before they close on their sale. They'll have a qualified intermediary that's then holding the money, right? They have 45 days from the closing of their sale to identify their replacement property. So you want to work with them very quickly to get them to identify your property. And specifically, they should identify the percentage interest they're buying in your project. So if they're buying a 10% interest, they should say, I'm buying a 10% interest in 123 Main Street, Dallas, Texas, let's say. So that's important. And then once they're ready to close with you, it's pretty much, it's a little bit different. They'll actually have to be a formal closing whereby if sometimes you see these parties come in together with the syndicate to buy the property, but essentially a deeded interest will go to that buyer. Through a closing, we, as the qualified intermediary, take assignment of whatever agreement you have with them, the benefits of that, and we fund the transaction. So if we have $1 million, we'll send $1 million, to whoever's handling the closing, and the deed will go to the buyer directly. So you have to be able to have legal counsel or a title company or somebody who's going to actually do that deed. That's essentially it. And certainly legal counsel should be involved in what we call a tenant in common agreement between the parties.
Sorry, William, I'm just going to jump into a question to Mike, because this is really fascinating. So question, Mike, does a syndicator require agreement from the other investors to be able to bring in 1031 exchange investor?
Well, that's a good question. Essentially, it's going to depend on whatever that syndication agreement provides. So typically, the limited partners in a syndicate don't have much control over how things are structured. And so, the syndicators generally, as the manager of the syndicate or the general partner even, depending on what your structure is, has the ability to make those decisions, typically. And there may be exceptions to that, but typically they should be permitted to do that.
That's a great question. And anything else that, as the operator, it was a great question. How does it bind our hands, by allowing a 1031, and anything else that would be negative, that would negatively affect the operations or could potentially negatively affect it? I mean, just like not being able to sell because this one person has decided, they don't want to sell their interest, or at least delaying the sale. Anything else that we need to be aware of before entering into something like this?
Well, the other problem, of course, is that they also have the right to sell, right? So it's their property. They can sell at any point that they can find a buyer. So you may, be in business with, John, and John decides to sell to Mary, and you may not like Mary. And typically you can structure things. You can have things like, right of first option. So the syndicate may have the option if John wants to sell, they have the option to buy John out rather than let John sell in the free market. So there's some protection you can have there. Fair market value, obviously. Those are the typical headaches that you face with the 1031 investor in a syndicated deal. I mean, there's some other structures you can set up that I'm not seeing too much of syndicated deals, but people are using things called Delaware statutory trusts on the institutional level, which is a different structure. It's similar to tenant in common. We can spend an hour just talking about Delaware statutory trust, so we won't do that. But that's another thing that that people on the institutional level are looking at. Whereas they used to sell, companies like Inland Capital and Pasco used to sell tenant and common investments. They found it much preferable to sell Delaware statutory trusts. And so that's been kind of the structure since the financial crisis. So that's something that even the smaller syndicators can look at. Again, you're going to want to have good counsel structure those transactions for you. And that may be kind of another way to get into it.
Okay. So the investors reached out and says, hey, I've got a property I'm going to sell. I'd like to do a 1031 exchange. They're going to connect with somebody like yourself, a custodian, to get the 1031 process started. Then they're going to sell their property, they're going to identify 3 other properties, and then they're going to sell their property, and then you all would help handle that transaction, right? Actually taking the funds from the sale to investing in with this operator.
Correct. Yeah, essentially we are the middleman in the exchange. We do all that documentation that's necessary for tax purposes, the assignment of both contracts. I just want to say that they can identify up to 3 properties. They don't have to identify 3 properties, and they can even go beyond, but there's some additional rules that apply to that. One other thing I want to mention, because people do forget this, and this is maybe another potential stumbling block with a syndicate, is that the taxpayer has to do 2 things to fully defer their gain. They have to buy property that's equal or greater in value to what they're selling, and they have to spend all the equity from their sale. Okay, that often means that if they had debt on the property they sold, they will need to take on new debt on their acquisition or assume debt. So to the extent that somebody has a debt component on their sale, that may provide issues on acquiring their replacement property if they're buying as a tenant in common with the syndicate, because they'll have to find a lender for their interests, and they are not necessarily going to be part of the syndicate's debt on the property. So that's some of the nuance that really needs to be looked at when you're considering these deals. Obviously, your preference is that somebody's coming in with doesn't have debt because the syndicator wants cash.
Yeah. Wow.
Mike,
So or go ahead, Alex.
Mike, can you add to the point of how long does it take for an operator to set up a TIC structure? Meaning, because we're dealing with such a short time frame, right? Are there syndicators, like if Whitney decides that he wants to accept 1031 clients, does he already has to label himself as such? Does he have to have a structure to set up? Is it something that has to be done a year before? Like, can you talk to with this audience about, as an operator, how long does it take to actually set up and to accept a 1031 exchange client? Is that okay with me?
Yes, that's great. Please.
Yeah, I mean, it really should not take much time. Legal counsel can basically do a deed in seconds. Their paralegal, do deeds all the time. So the deed is a non-issue. The TIC agreement, there's some good boilerplate things out there that basically hit all the checklist items from the revenue procedure. It's setting up that structure, and probably the legal structure is the easiest part of it. It's more the operating structure, right? And figuring out internally how you're going to do this, and working with the accountants to make sure that the returns and everything match. But as far as the transactional structure, it can be done very, very quickly.
What about the timing too? I was just thinking, okay, the investor has located, the investment they're going to invest in. They've notified that, but then all of a sudden, they've said, okay, we're going to invest in this syndication, but then maybe that closing date got extended 60 days for whatever reason. Are they going to miss their deadline of being able to invest that capital?
Yeah, that is a potential issue. They have a maximum of 180 days from the closing of their sale to complete their acquisition. Typically, unless your investors come to you at the last minute, yeah, it should be long enough, because they have to identify your project within 45 days, right? So let's say they wait till the last minute and they identify on the 45th day. Now you got another 135 days to close. When I first started practicing law, that might have been a problem. These days, transactions are closing inside of a week. So that's not typically an issue. The 180-day requirement is usually the lesser of the 2 evils. The 45 days is usually where people stumble.
Anything that investor needs to be aware of that they may not know when they're partnering, with an operator like that? Because to me, it really seems like more of a partnership, because you're giving them quite a bit of control here, if they're having that ownership. So like you said, this needs to be somebody that you know or potentially have done business with maybe before or something like that. You're not just bringing in somebody random to 1031 into your deal, or that's never been in real estate before. But anything else that they need to know that could negatively affect their investment or investing with an operator?
Yeah, and just it's a typical. We always talk to people about investors. Anytime you're buying real property, whether it's a syndicated deal, whether it's a standalone property, whether you're buying an institutional Delaware statutory trust or a net lease property for Walgreens or something like that, you got to kick the tires, right? I mean, there's no guaranteed returns out there. People hype a lot and say, you're going to get X, you're going to get Y, but we all know how real estate works. And, especially, we're in a hot economy right now for real estate. So you got to take a look at the upside and the downside as well. So that would be the typical recommendation I have for any real estate investor, and syndicators included. As far as the 1031 structure, they just have to make sure it's structured appropriately. They don't want to give up too much control and be considered a partner, because then that could bust their exchange. But other than that, it can work. I don't want to certainly discourage anybody from being creative and structuring these things. It's just that it requires some advanced planning, which, I've been around real estate investors long enough to know that sometimes advanced planning is not their strong suit.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that we would probably recommend is to look to your current investors and have a conversation where you educate them about the value of 1031, because it's possible that they have other real estate that they might be able to sell off and come into new deals. And those are the people you're currently doing deals with and currently have current investors. They might not be even aware this is an option. So those people you already vetted, you trust, they already see the value of relationship. So you'd be surprised how many people don't believe you can do a 1031 onto a syndicate. So your job as a syndicator could be about educating your current investors, not just future investors, about this potential. And obviously, Mike and I are there to support you in being able to help them have all the information that can make the most educated educated decision about how to move forward. So your current investors, you want to make sure that the current investor is educated about the value of a 1031 exchange, because many of them, you'll be surprised how they would not know.
That's great advice, and no doubt about it. We definitely need to educate them about this. And we are about out of time, unfortunately. We just got a couple minutes left. But maybe you can briefly speak to or quickly speak to the 1031 exchange. When we're selling a deal as an operator, into another deal, and how the investors would work moving from one to another if they wanted, to another deal if they wanted to, 1031 from one deal to another.
Yeah, ideally, you will be such a great syndicator and manager of your property that everybody wants to stay with you and does not want to cash out. In that case, you've got a home run. It's easy. You just go as a syndicate, you go to your contract, you sell to your buyer. You have the same deadlines, 45, 180, and then you go close on a replacement property, and everybody goes along with you and continues to make money until they can roll it into the next bigger and even better project. That's ideal. If not, if you have the advanced knowledge that a sale is imminent, or maybe it's part of your business plan, you're going to hold this property 7 years, at which time, if the market supports it, you're going to sell. So maybe you start doing some advanced planning in year 5 or 6, and you say to your investors, well, who wants to take the ride and who wants to separate? And if you know that people are separating, let's get them out of the partnership now, deed the property to them as tenants in common, and begin operating differently. Maybe as you as the syndicator, maybe giving up some of your rights in that instance for a short period of time, for a year or two, and then everybody goes their separate ways, or some people go their separate ways in year 7 when the property is sold.
And just especially, Mike, maybe just talk for a second, especially in states like New York and California, that's really important.
Yeah, that's a good point, because we're less concerned. The federal government, not that they do not audit 1031 exchanges, because they do, but they do have some limitations and resources, and they've kind of butted heads and have fought this partnership issue several times. And in tax courts, the results have not been favorable for the IRS by and large. So we tend to be more concerned about how the state governments look at this. So if if you have investors who have a property, your property's in Texas, your investors are mostly Texans, and they're going to do this, there's no Texas income tax, right? So, there's no state regime looking at this.
Yeah,
but if if you have a New York project with a New York investor or a combination of New York and California investors, well, the states tend to be a little bit more aggressive and are taking a look at these transactions a little bit more closely, particularly California. And more recently, we're seeing it in New York. Some of the other states, I'm not seeing as much in some of the other states, such as New Jersey and all the other income tax regime states in the country, which are the majority. We're not hearing as much, but that doesn't mean it's not happening.
Meaning you're going to want to establish a tenant common agreement way in advance before the sale. So that's why that conversation in year 5 is really important. If you're in Texas or Florida, you shouldn't worry so much. But then, honest conversations happening, year 5 is really important because you need a year or two to establish that tenant common partnership, so it'll be held up by the state tax authority.
Wow. Well, unfortunately, guys, we are out of time. It goes by fast, and it's an important topic. And ultimately, I know I got to have somebody like yourself on the team. If we're doing 1031 exchanges, because it's not something I'm going to be able to take care of myself and do it legally, no doubt about it. So, but tell the listeners though how they can get in touch with you all and learn more about you.
Good.
So the easiest way is to reach out to Alex and Mass and 1031.com. We can have a preliminary conversations just to make sure that it's a good fit for the conversation. I'll bring Mike on the call, and we can take every situation is very different. But when you have someone like Mike who's deferred over $1 billion, that he's taking care of a situation that's similar to yours, and we can make sure that it's done legally and appropriately to make sure you have the benefits of 1031 exchange. And our goal is to be able to be as a resource to syndicators like Whitney and others to make sure that we're available for any questions you might have. Use us as a resource. We're one of that Swiss knife in your pocket. So Alex and Mass at 1031.com, and we'll set up a call and would love to have a conversation with you. Again, use as a tool. We'd love to have conversations exactly like the one we had today. That's what we live for. We're kind of nerds like that. We're excited about having talks about this.
Yeah, and I would just add, we like to develop relationships, and so we're not transactional necessarily. Certainly, we want to handle your exchanges, but if you have questions about an upcoming transaction or something that you're thinking about or planning, but you're not quite at the point where it's ready to boil, feel free to give us a call. We're more than happy to, have that initial conversation.
Thank you for listening to the Real Estate Syndication Show, brought to you by LifeBridge Capital. LifeBridge Capital works with investors nationwide to invest in real estate, while also donating 50% of its profits to assist parents who are committing to adoption. LifeBridge Capital, making a difference, one investor and one child at a time. Connect online at www.lifebridgecapital.com for free material and videos to further your success.